Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Card sense Jimmy Bond, they call you.
Mr. Bond.
Jimmy.
Mr. Bond. Jimmy, listen to me. Jimmy. Bond and I are on opposite sides of the fence.
It's James Bond. Mr. Bond. Is that Mr. Bond?
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Good evening, Mr. Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond. This is Bond.
Yes, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Oh, Mr. Bond, the chips have been counted. 87 million francs in all.
Mr. Bond, that's for
James Bond. Jimmy, it's lighter.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Jimmy.
It's Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Jimmy.
All right, Mr. Bond. 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 Mr. Bond.
Jimmy.
Be fair, Mr. Bond.
James Bond.
Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond. James.
Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond.
James Bond.
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 Mr. Bond.
Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James Bond here.
Mr. Bond.
James.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Love Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James Bond.
James Bond here.
James.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
James Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond here. James Bond.
James.
Mr. and Mrs. David Somerset.
James.
Hello, James.
Yes, James. Mr. Somerset.
Mrs. Somerset. Mrs. Somerset.
James.
Mrs. Somerset.
Yeah. Bond traveling at Somerset.
Bond.
Who is Bond?
Come on. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James Bond.
James.
Bond here. Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond.
James.
James. Mr. Bond. James.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
By the way, my name is Bond.
As quickly as possible.
James Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Do you expect me to talk? No, Mr. Bond. I expect you to die. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Oh, Mr. Bond. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Hey, James. James, good luck.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Oh, nice to have met you, Mr. Bond.
I can't hear you, James.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. James. Now, James.
James.
James Bond.
Mr.
Bond.
Oh, yes. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Well, James.
So Bond.
James Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Bond.
Bond.
Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Bond.
Mr. Bond. James. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. James Bond. Mr. Bond. Here you go, Mr. Bond. James Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. James.
Bond. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
James Bond. James Bond. James. Sir James. James. James Bond. Sir James. Sir James. Oh, James. Bond. James. James Bond.
Sir James. Sir James. Sir James. Sir James. Sir James. James. Jamie Light. Sir James. James Bond. Joe James. James Bond. Joe. Jamie Light. Bond.
Sir James. Jimmy Bond. Then James Bond. James Bond. Sir James Bond.
Sir James. Sir James. Sir James. Sir James. Sir James. James Bond.
James Bond. Mr. Bond. Mata Bond. Mata Bond? Sir James Bond.
James Bond.
Monsieur Bond.
James Bond.
James Bond.
No, Sir James. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. James.
Sir
But that's James Bond.
Bond. James Bond. James Bond. James Bond.
Oh, James Bond.
James Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Bond is James Bond.
Mr. Bond.
James Bond.
Pardon, monsieur.
Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Bond.
James Bond.
And Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. And Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Bond. Mr. Bond. Oh, Bond wird.
Sir James.
Bond. James Bond. James. James Bond.
Jimmy Bond.
James.
Sir James. Sir James.
Sir James.
James.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. James Bond. Bond son. Mr. Bond. Bond son. Bond son.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher. Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher. Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Goodbye, Mr. Fisher.
Goodbye, Mr. Fisher. Mr. Fisher.
Chasing girls will be the end of your Bond son. Bond son. Bond son. Bond son.
Bond son.
Bond son.
James Bond.
But Bond is dead.
Bond is alive. Kill Bond! Now!
Bond son. Bond son.
James Bond. You only live twice, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
My name's Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Commander Bond.
Mr. Bond. So are you, Mr. Bond? Mr. Bond. No, Mr. Bond.
Commander Bond.
Mr. Bond?
Mr. Bond.
James. Oh, James. Ready, James.
James Bond here.
He wants you, James.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Bond. Mr. Bond.
Track Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. James.
Mr. Bond.
Sir Thomas Bond. Bond. Commander Bond.
Sir Hilary Bray Baronet. Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary Bray Baronet. Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary.
Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary.
Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary.
Hilly.
Hilly. Hilly.
Hilly, you old devil.
Sir Hilary.
Hilly.
Hilly.
Sir Hilary.
Hilly. Hilly.
I'm Sir Hilary Bray.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James. Stay close to me, James. James, where are we heading? James. 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 James.
James Bond.
James.
Bond. James Bond.
James. James.
James Bond.
Look, James. James, I wish you luck.
Bond. James Bond.
My name is Bond. James Bond.
Commander Bond. Commander Bond. Commander Bond.
Mr. Franks.
Franks. Peter Franks.
Franks. And Franks. You just killed James Bond.
Mr. Bond.
He's Mr. Franks. Mr. Franks. Peter Franks.
Please, Mr. Frank. James.
Mr. Franks.
Mr. Franks.
Mr. Franks.
Mr. Franks. Mr. Franks. Mr. Franks. Frank.
James.
My name is Franks. Peter Franks.
Mr. Frank. Back to you, Mr. Franks.
Peter Franks.
Peter Franks.
But James.
Peter. Peter.
Klaus Hergersheimer, G-section. Just checking on radiation shield.
James. May I finally call you James?
Mr. and Mrs. Jones.
Yes, sir.
James.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Right idea, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James Bond. James Bond. That's
Never mind, James Bond.
Maxwell, James, and I.
James Bond.
James.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Oh, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Right again, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Come on, Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
James.
James. James. Oh, James. James. How the hell do we get those diamonds down again?
Fine, James. James.
My name's Bond. James Bond. My name is...
James is for tombstones, baby.
Spades, James.
James.
Name's Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mrs. Bond has been expecting you.
Mrs. Bond. Mrs. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mrs. Bond. Mrs. Bond.
James. James.
Where is Bond now? Where is Bond now?
Bond.
Arrest Bond.
James.
Jim.
Jim.
Bond. Jim.
James.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Bond.
Bond.
Ah, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Ciao, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James. 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 You James?
Mr. Bond.
Good day, Bond.
James.
My name is Bond. James Bond. My name's Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James. James.
Commander Bond.
In future, Commander Bond.
Mr. Scaramanga. Mr. Scaramanga.
Bond. James Bond. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
And James.
The name Scaramanga.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Bond doesn't know you're in Bangkok.
James. James.
Mr. Bond. It's a very great pleasure for me, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James.
Mr. Bond.
James. 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 James.
Bonjour, Monsieur Bond.
Forgive me, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. If you say so, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. This way, Mr. Bond.
James.
Mr. Bond. Oh, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Monsieur Bond. Monsieur Bond.
James. 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 Oh, James. Oh, James.
Bond. Bond. Bond, are you there?
James Bond.
Oh, James. But, James, I need you.
So does England.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Morning, 007.
Hello, Q.
Morning, Commander.
Good morning, sir.
Captain Forsyth.
Commander, sir.
Commander Bond, sir.
James Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Commander James Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
My name is Bond. James Bond.
You forgot your drink, Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. It's Mr. Bond.
Hello, James.
And James.
Thank you, James.
Name is Sterling.
Sterling.
Mr. Sterling.
My name is Sterling. Robert Sterling.
Mr. Sterling.
Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling.
James Bond.
James. James. James.
James Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Observe, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James.
Bond.
Well, sure, but James.
James. James. Commander Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James. James.
Bond, what do you think you're doing?
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Oh, Mr. Bond.
James. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
My name is Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond.
James.
Mr. Bond. James.
My dear Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. You missed Mr. Bond. You were with Bond last night.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. James. James.
Bond. Mr. Bond.
Hang on, James. James.
Well done, James. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James.
Mr. Bond. James Bond. My dear Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James.
What's Bond doing?
James.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James.
Moneypenny? My name is Bond. James Bond. Bond. James Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James, please, James. James, 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 Mr. Bond.
James.
My name is Bond.
James.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James.
James.
Mr. Bond.
James.
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 Bond.
Bond, 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 Bond,
Bond. Bond.
Mr. Bond,
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Bond,
Toro.
James.
James.
Commander Bond.
James?
Commander Bond. Bond.
Commander Bond.
Call me James.
Commander Bond.
Name's Bond. I believe you have a reservation for me. Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond.
James, James, over here.
James.
Mr. Bond.
James Bond. Mr. Bond? Get Bond. Mr. Bond is indeed a very rare breed, soon to be made extinct.
James Bond.
Bond, Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Oh, James.
James.
Commander Bond. Commander Bond.
James. James. James.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
My name is Bond.
Oh, you're Mr. Bond. James.
Good morning, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond?
James. James.
Bond.
Good to see you, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond! Mr. Bond!
Mr. Bond. James.
James. James.
James.
James. James.
Mr. Bond. Surely good, Bond. Mr. Bond?
James. James.
My name is Bond. James Bond.
Mr. James Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. James Bond.
James Bond?
James.
Mr. Bond?
Mr. Bond.
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 Commander Bond.
Bond, all right.
Bond is still in there.
James.
Sorry, Mr. Bond.
Commander Bond.
Call me James.
James.
James. Commander Bond. Mr. Bond. Bond.
St. John Smith.
St. John Smythe.
Monsieur Smythe.
Monsieur Smythe.
St. John Smythe.
St. John Smythe.
St. John Smythe. St. John Smythe. James St. John Smythe.
Mr. Smythe.
Mr. St. John Smythe.
James St. John Smythe.
St. John Smythe.
St. John Smythe is this afternoon. Mr. St. John Smythe. You amuse me, Mr. Bond.
James Bond. James. James.
Stock. James Stock. James Stock. Stock. James Stock.
James. 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 James Stock.
The name is Bond. James Bond. My real name is Bond. James Bond.
James. 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 James.
For Comrade Bond. Commander Bond.
Oh, James. Who are you?
Bond. James Bond.
Bond. Bond.
Bond.
James. James Bond.
Mr. Bond? Or James? James?
Sorry, Mr. Bond.
James. Superb, Mr. Bond. Superb.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bond.
Bond.
James Bond. 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 James Bond is a good shot.
James.
Bond.
James.
James. I'm sorry, James.
British Agent 007 James Bond.
James.
James. James is trapped. Bond.
James. James.
Go, James.
James. James.
James. James. James.
Let's go, James. James.
James.
Bond.
James, love, always, Stella and Felix.
Oh, James. Oh, James.
It's Bond.
James.
Senor Bond.
Senor Bond.
Yes?
I'm Miss Kennedy.
Oh?
Mr. Bond's executive secretary.
Senor Bond.
Bond.
Start ringing.
James Bond.
Senor Bond.
Sweet dreams, Mr. Bond.
James Bond.
James. James.
Senor Bond.
Bond's close.
James. 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 James.
James.
Bond is escaped.
Bond.
Take care.
James.
James? For England.
James.
James!
For England, James!
James, James, James.
James.
Bonsoir, Monsieur Bond.
Thank you, Mr.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. James. 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 James Bond. James.
You don't like me, Bond.
Bond.
James Bond. Stiff-ass bread.
Hey, Bond. It's Jimmy. Hand me that hammer, Jimbo.
Jimmy.
James Bond. Oh, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Hello, James. James Bond. James. For England, James. Mr. Bond. Commander Bond. Mr. Bond.
Bond is alive.
Bond. James Bond. Only Bond. James and Mr. Bond. James. James.
Jimbo. Yo, James.
James. Mr. Bond.
James. James. For England, James.
James. James.
James.
Bond.
Bond here.
James.
That ship.
James. James. James.
James.
James. James.
If you just sign here, Mr. Bond.
This is the new banker, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
Tell me, Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond will have a vodka martini, shaken, not stirred. James. James Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
James.
Bond.
James.
James.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Yo, Jimbo! Jimbo!
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. James Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond's heart.
Mr. Bond.
Bond is...
Bond is dead.
Commander Bond.
Mr. Bond. You see, Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
James.
Mr. Bond.
The Bond made it.
Commander Bond.
James.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James. James Bond.
Sorry, James.
James.
James Bond.
Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. And who's afraid now, Mr. Bond?
James Bond.
Bond, James Bond. What's James?
But Bond.
Bond was unarmed.
Mikhail Arkhov.
Dr. Arkoff.
No hard feelings, Mr. Bond. Name's Bond. James Bond.
James. James. Bond will succeed. And Bond? Bond.
Bond to Robinson, do you copy? Bond to Robinson, copy.
Mr. Bond.
Because Bond is dead.
Alan. Bond is alive. James Bond.
James Bond!
James.
James! James!
Mr. Van Beer.
James Bond.
Mr. Van Beer.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James Bond.
James?
Bond. James Bond. Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Commander Bond.
James Bond. Bond thinks differently. James Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond? James.
Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
James. James.
James!
James.
Bond.
James.
Bond.
James Bond.
Bond.
See, Mr. Bond.
James. Oh, James.
Bond.
Bond. Bond. Bond. James.
It's Bond.
Bond.
Bond! Bond!
Bond. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Good evening, Mr. Bond.
I'm Mr. Arlington Beach.
Bond.
James Bond. Beach.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond?
Mr. Bond. Welcome, Mr. Beach. Or is that Bond? I'm a little confused.
Well, we wouldn't want that, would we?
Mr. Bond? Oh, Monsieur Bond. Monsieur Bond? Mr. Bond?
Mr. Bond.
Monsieur Bond?
James was right.
Monsieur Bond?
Bond. Mr. Bond.
James.
James.
Bond. 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 Bond.
Bond.
Monsieur Bond? Monsieur Bond? Monsieur Bond wins.
You are a funny man, Mr. Bond.
James.
James Bond.
Mr. Bond.
I'm sorry, James. James. James.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
Bond?
But I do need to know, Bond. I need to know that I can trust you. What the hell is this organization, Bond? Get Bond.
I've got Bond. Bond. Bond.
Bond.
Bond, we have your location as approaching an airfield.
Bond.
It's James Bond, British Secret Service.
Get Bond.
Bond.
Bond. Bond. Bond's...
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Bond, can we...
Bond.
Mr. Bond wanted to speak to you. Bond.
Bond. James.
James. James.
Bond, I need you back.
I never left.
Bond! Bond!
Bond.
Bond's tests.
I didn't know Bond passed the test.
He didn't.
Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. Bond.
James.
Bond. Bond.
Bond. James. James Bond.
Make sure Bond's dead.
Mr. Bond.
James?
James.
Bond. James. Bond.
James.
Welcome, James.
Ciao, Mickey Mouse.
Bond. James.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond. You're a kite dancing in a hurricane, Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Bond. Bond. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Two Jameses.
Bond.
Bond. James.
Mr. Bond.
So, James, why did you come?
I came here to kill you.
And I thought you came here to die.
Well, it's all a matter of perspective.
James? James.
We're a kite dancing in a hurricane, Mr. Bond.
James and I.
So, James.
James? James. James.
James.
Let's look around here, James.
I'm Bond.
Bye, James Bond.
Bond?
Okay, Mr. Bond. I'm afraid that this is off limits. Even to you, so,
we're all really busy here.
go and
Just
find a
do what you gotta
martini,
do.
shaken,
Okay,
not
buddy?
stirred somewhere else, okay?